and then in June 1847 passed the Irish Poor Law Extension Act, which mandated that already destitute communities raise their own tax monies for poor relief, not 1 farthing of which was to go to heads of household renting a 1/4 acre or more of land. To qualify for relief, starving tenants had to abandon their farms. Those who remained were evicted for failure to pay their taxes. The newly landless, who could afford passage off the island, immigrated. Large numbers of those who remained behind perished. From 1845 through the early 1850s, more than 1 million died, and 2 million more, about 1/4 of the population, departed for North America. Mass migrations are made up of individual journeys, and while Patrick Kennedy carried with him many of the same scars as did his compatriots, he differed from them in significant ways. The Kennedys were from County Wexford, on the southeast coast of Ireland, a region well served, Irish historian David Doyle has written, by banks and trade networks and by schools. Population densities were relatively low, land more fertile, agriculture somewhat diversified, land holdings larger and costlier, and the percentage who immigrated smaller than that from other Irish counties. While in the poorer north and west small farmers divided their land among their sons, in the southeast the family farms were held intact and passed on from father to oldest son. As the 3rd son and 4th child in his family, Patrick would have no inheritance, and he knew it. The Kennedy leasehold would be passed on to his older brother. Additional resources would go toward a dowry for his older sister and a second leasehold for brother number 2. Patrick could, had he chosen, have remained on the family leasehold as a landless laborer. Instead, he left the family farm at Dunganstown and walked the 6.5 kilometers north along the River Barrow to New Ross, the nearby still thriving port town, where he found employment at a cooperage. There was a decent living to be made as a cooper, or barrel maker. As the commercialization of Irish agriculture proceeded apace in the 1830s and 1840s, more land had been dedicated to the production of wheat and barley for export off the island or to local breweries and distilleries. Whatever form it took, grain or liquor, the barley and wheat were transported in wooden barrels, which were handcrafted by New Ross coopers. In good times, there had been more than enough work for coopers like Patrick Kennedy, formerly of Dunganstown. But these were not good times. By 1848 or 1849, the effects of blight, famine, and depression had reached into every corner and occupational stratum, undertakers excepted. Patrick Kennedy, already 1 step removed from the family farm, had little to detain him in Ireland. There are several young Patricks, Pats, and P. Kennedys in the passenger lists of ships arriving in Boston in the late 1840s from Liverpool or New Ross. We cannot be sure which was our Patrick, but we can be certain that whether he left from New Ross or Liverpool, he was 6 weeks on a coffin ship, so called because for so many it would be a final resting place. With little edible food and a minimum of potable water, hundreds of men, women, infants, and the elderly were locked together in darkened, unventilated ship's holds for weeks on end, hatches battened, with no room to stretch, no decent air to breathe, and no escape from the accumulating human waste, the scourge of seasickness, hunger, and thirst, the stench of decay, disease, and dying, and the endless boredom, broken only by fits of panic when storms rocked or fire threatened. Only the strongest survived the passage with body and soul intact. Patrick was one of these. He arrived in East Boston, or Noddle's Island as it was still known, and remained there for the remainder of his life. East Boston was everything that New Ross was not. The population was growing, jobs and housing were available, and no one, not even the poorest of the poor, starved to death. East Boston had been annexed to Boston in the 1630s, but remained virtually ignored and uninhabited until 1833, when William Sumner, a large landowner, joined forces with a few partners and, incorporated as the East Boston Company, raised sufficient capital to subdivide the land into a grid of streets and squares, sell off the most promising sites for vacation homes, build wharves, and arrange for regular ferry service across the harbor to Boston. By 1835, the population on the island was up to 604 from 24 just 10 years before. 4 years later, the partners' wildest dreams were realized when Samuel Cunard, who had been granted the right to transfer mail from England to North America, chose East Boston as his American terminus. By 1840, Cunard ships from Liverpool were arriving with regularity every fortnight, carrying not just the mail, but every variety of English manufacture.